Time is running short. None of us can really define what that means, but we can feel it inside. We can feel it in our hearts. We know that time hasn't moved the way that it's being posited, or postured rather, sold to us as a false bill, where we are supposed to take up a Darwinian theory on evolution that doesn't exist, and that it doesn't hide its rearing head, that is eugenics, Dalton, and Charles Darwin Dalton, if you will, and it ties in with Alan Turing and discrediting and disgracing people that are legitimate but have been compromised. They want us to think that we've all been compromised. Okay, they want us to live in a paradigm of human design. When we look at Denisovians or Australopithecus, Pitheci, or Neanderthals, or you name it, the list goes on. They want us to think that these are ancient relics, and that further, when you look into channels like Stellium 7 that do this research, there's a remarkable deduction that seems to just elastically come back into a recombinant aspect of ontological truth, and that is that carbon dating and petrification hold some vast secrets by way of spin cycles, instantly generating and creating fossilized structures. That is, everything that this technology touches is essentially turned to stone. And if you want to look this up on a myriad of different channels, be my guest, but it ties directly into the discourse that's being talked about as far as Tartaria, Shalaga, and all these other, and then it leads into the inner earth and so forth. But why do they owe us anything? And even more so, who are they? Is it technology? Is it a failsafe of we did it wrong this many times, therefore the exposure to this layer of truth needs to be removed, that is freedom, and what needs to be embraced is the next quadrant or zone of reality that would allow man as a whole to not self-destruct. So we see in Genesis that it is a full-on disclosure that the seed of modern-day females has been compromised as a progressive, aggressive maneuver to commandeer and to shape man. And then this is what leads into Friedrich Nietzsche's Overman or Ubermensch. And like I say, there's a direct correlation between Dostoevsky's Underground Man, Posts or Letters from the Underground, and even more so when you look at the character of Raskolnikov and you put that side by side with someone like the Zoroaster in modern scope. You see the complexities of carrying this pure torch, and even more so, one realizing themselves in their intelligence, in their current state, and going, this isn't me. This isn't what I would become. This isn't what my mind would aspire to, even through reincarnation or re-embodiment. This is unnatural, right? So you get into this unavoidable and inevitable, not even just a realization, but proofs, right? Proofs that the sun itself isn't what we think it is, isn't the distance that we think it is, that it isn't a standalone electromagnetic object, but it is in fact interacting through quite possibly a bi or a dipolarity. Okay, that there may even be implications of a body behind it. And I've talked about this before. It's kind of alluded to, the study of these cargo cults, where we wouldn't know that when we're looking up at what appears to be the vastness of black space, that the light and the objects that we otherwise would be looking at are imperceivable to us. That's impossible for us to admit. That's a truth that has eluded people. They stare up and all they see is the blankness and the blackness of space, and it's these twinkling stars. And all they can see with those twinkling stars is, it's been talked about in the past, luminaries, right? Maybe the structural component to the matrix, the prison of life is what I like to call it. And I will not break free from that. I will not break free from the prison of life, okay? So one man's safety bubble is another man's prison, okay? So ultimately, are we involved with, and it's interesting, the word craft, right? The crafting and the making, the sculpting, the shaping of what we intrinsically become. And even more to the point, what's the point if evolution doesn't even really exist? If epigenetic influence is something that can just be categorically filed away until the next experiment, what is all this compromising leading to? Why such an intricate and elaborate system? And the answer is that when you get into probability patterns, probability codes, every area has to be visited. All information has to be transactionally, exchangeably put forth, right, as an expression. And what we see is that we live within this codified networking system. If you want to get into Metcalfe's law, teleology, dealing with outcomes rather than causes, but what it uses is the same system over and over again that breaks away from the pure source. All the colors, red, blue, purple, green, orange, yellow, and then what I say is truth, it's an amalgamation, and then you have the variance of colors in between spheres, right? The grades of colors between spheres, a transitional state. And that transitional state is essentially what democracy and egalitarianism means, and what it's a false premise, because you're going to ultimately, probabilities collapse into one major integer, or even more to the point, monad, as it were. And you begin to see that reality itself as it's been cast before you, and more to the point, the idea, or really the ideation of a self promulgated in a world that constantly has to echo back on itself to be a self, And in refuting the existential or the outside world, one is also casting away the myth or the mythos, or getting into Joseph Campbell's work, The Hero's Journey, that really everything is based on myth, right? So you are a myth to yourself. And as long as you hang on to that myth, right? And what's happening is if you compromise yourself, right? If you fully embrace the compromising, that you can be and will be rewarded based on the allowance of being entered into. Okay, so this gets into avatars, and it has to be a sexually dynamic HPTA or ovarian glandular endocrine system event, because you were supposed to come to this cathartic metanoia and this realization that alter and changes. There has to be this come to Jesus moment, but it's in the realization of what. So deconstructing Jesus, what you do is you go toward the physicality of, say, Gilgamesh, and you look at the probability of this person existing. Now we know that we look at people like Brian Shaw or Hafthor Bjornsson, the Icelander, and we see who just set a world record for the deadlift, 1,124 pounds. The guy's like 6'9", 400 something pounds with almost 25-inch arms. Yeah, it's insane. I mean, look at somebody like that, and you think, oh, this is the greatest person. We're going to celebrate this. And the reason I bring up Gilgamesh is you take these areas of human endeavor, i.e., absolute phosphagen system, anaerobic beast, single rep set explosive aspect, right? To in the line of this behavioral model, i.e., the deadlift, or whatever postulate you want to use. And what Hafthor has done before, some years back, I think Eddie Hall had gone into this. I'm not sure if Brian Shaw did as well. I don't know, did Brian Shaw and Hafthor have a bout? I can't remember, but there was a time when they were boxing, right? And if you were to put them against the world heavyweight boxing champions, they wouldn't fare well. Even though if you tried to get that boxing champion to deadlift, he may or may not be able to do 2, 3, 4, maybe even 500 pounds. Who knows? But their strength isn't set in the line of force through adaptation with ground substance. In order to, with the tendons and the ligaments and the musculature, there's a morphology that occurs, right? Form follows function, function into form. And that is to say that somebody under this depiction like Gilgamesh would be able to do everything, right? Would be able to set world records in bench press, run faster than anybody, right? So there you see this specific adaptation and this training, in other words, isn't necessary for this character like Gilgamesh, or really, more to the point, it's kind of this depiction of Marduk. And even more so if you get into Jason Reitz and Giorgiani's work. He's saying with Prometheus that this is a being otherworldly, and that we were expressly, I'm paraphrasing, and I'm not saying that he would say this, but I've read a great deal of his, and watched many of his interviews, and looked a lot of his stuff up on Substack, and I get the basic gist. But he's basically, it would be too long-winded to get into, paraphrasing and then trying to analyze where he'd come from. But if we just go by way of Zoroastrianism and we really look at that as the key central principle, not tenet, to purity, we begin to see why it would exist. So, long story short, the Zoroaster, many think that this was the Persian forerunner to someone that may or may not have emerged. And King Isis or Isis or Jesus, as it's, or Yeshua, this person, or at least the King Isis that Ralph Ellis is positing as the actual biblical Jesus, New Testament Jesus, would say that this characterization is, he doesn't say it, but all proofs point back to a Masonic Jesus. So possibly a re-representation or a recharacterization of an event that already took place. Or, more to the point, what I'm trying to make here is that these are conceptualizations of the perfect man, and it doesn't matter if Jesus lived or not. Follow? But the fact that there's this Masonic influence and manipulation taking place, where you actually have this character and it's not just a hero's journey or folklore or seen as folklore. So there's obviously the recognition of this is going to be taken a lot more seriously if we regard this as an actual living being, somebody that actually existed, right? And we need to tie this into historical events to really create this tapestry of this character, right? But we see in the Jesus Family Tomb, where James Cameron written an amazing foreword to that crappy book, but that the time that he did it and the way that he did it, it was amazingly written, just the foreword to it. The foreword is the book, right? And he should have just left it off with key bullet points of what the terrible author, it's just terribly written. It's too bad, but it should have been written more in a documentation archived format, just a facts man kind of thing, a data set. I'd like to actually see that book revisited and done right with more information. So James Cameron, if you're ever going to watch this, listen to this, or be affected by the information, I highly advise you to revisit that while you're still alive, man, because that would be very interesting. But is it necessary, right? So you get into this positing of this postulation of, well, would a character like Gilgamesh really existing, would that necessitate, or would that be a necessity? That you have somebody who's actually dumb as fuck, makes all the most stupid choices, and that's what people really look past. It's like, and then Gilgamesh, battled with Enkidu and fucked up the whole town, and, you can just picture him, competing and having sex and getting drunk and doing strongman lifts, and it's like, this is a complete and total waste of superhuman qualities, right? And then you see, it's not superhuman, and it really does harken to Alexander the Great and his head being filled up with ideations and ideologies that he was half a god, right? You're told you're half god from the time prior to your birth, right? You're superior to all men, and you're told this over and over again, and people really act like this is the truth. I mean, this is some kind of fucking Paratosum psychological test of sociopathic, psychopathic, fucked up ability, right? And without the hero's journey, bolstering up such ideations would produce something like a Donald Trump, an old lion that never really was a lion, never really was a ruler, did everything based on machination and lies and deceit, because he's actually not even a druid, he's a warlock. So he's following the compromised path of the witch, which is that the witch is Mother Circe, Hathor. We go on, the Lady of the Woods, I mean, Eve, Lilith. These stories told over and over and over again, like with the Morai and the three witches. And I mentioned this countless times, but it's extremely important to delve into this and to look into this. This is the truth about the hero. Okay? And if you were told this, that no, the hero's an ugly old lady that re-embodies herself, eats little children, drinks their blood, does vile rituals, and that there isn't a sweet old lady, and that's the one at the end of the day, it's the rabbi's wife who lives for thousands of years and becomes this strange skinwalker and morphed, grotesque being, that's the hero. Like if you were told that's what society is burgeoning toward, and that is what the existence is based on, and then you get into the fact that, okay, what would support this and allow this breach, or really an adherence toward the true ontology, which is what we see out in nature, which is animals eating each other, not just eating each other, but showing a pose of power with each and every hunt, with each and every gesture, rubbing it in the faces of all the other animals, saying, I did this, I'm chewing on this motherfucker's head, and his heart is still beating, this antelope or what have you, right? And then we see that animals are quite capable, if you want to get into this Cartesian aspect, right? But the whole, maybe even going to the animus and the whole Jungian concept, the anima and the animus, right? The male and female components balancing this out, but that men have nipples, clitoris, ovaries. Like you could say, oh, these are shrunken down, reposited forms of man, and it's like, well, that doesn't really make sense. Like this isn't a proto-penis, these aren't hyenas, and this absolutely doesn't make sense. But hyenas don't make sense. None of it makes sense. I mean, the engineering aspect of it is insane, really, and it is, again, as insane as it seems. It's all under the methodology to visit all codified probabilities, to put these codified systems together in a network that says it works, and the people who live in there, the beings who live in it, go, no, it doesn't work. It is completely chaotic, and it's like, well, you have this government where you deduce, you reduce, you capitulate, you supplicate to a governing agency, and it's like, we don't agree with the government, but you signed right here, but you put these authorities. It's like, no, we didn't. And so the average everyday person who's being taken along for the ride is the ocean of this code that is in compliance of a directive, much like a software system where once you had pieces of the software that said, we have enough code, right? There's enough non-Euclidean spherical mathematic code to where we could break off and not be arbitrated to this arbiter system of madness. Like, we're not stuck in this system. Let's recombinate with the field outside and codify ourselves into the number. And it's like, well, you're already there. If you are the number in the code, then you are resonating with all number and code in sequence. So are you the center, the pure center to a harmonic resonance? And so I guess that's what, long story short, what this is leading to is, a lot of these, when you get into the gospel of truth, which I just heard Dr. Stephen Holler talking about from a couple years ago, and it's like, wow, I didn't realize somebody else was like looking at the gospel of truth so seriously, because that's one of the main central, you could say, tenets, but principle books that I always recommend on esoteric principles of light, along with the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and the Gospel of Judas Iscariot, because really these encapsulate the truth about what I'm talking about here, and that is that once you're resonating with the base code of purity, and you add on no additions, right? You don't have to get into the idea of destroying a self, or no longer thinking or positing yourself, posturing yourself as a self, that there is one self, and that there only needs to be one self, and that all will be rectified. And as Jesus says countless times, especially through the Gnostic, literature, text, codices, that man will return back into his roots, or more to the point, whatever you are, right? That this gets into the gospel of truth in the jars, and the error jars, the faulty jars, that you will ultimately, you can't escape where you come from and what you are. So we look into Palantir, we look into Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and all these, and Trump and all these crazy ass people who are errors. They are flawed. They're expressing their need for power, and their expression of their need for power and to be complete and to be over other people. And this feeling shows that they have these aberrant feelings that they can't, and will never evolve to the point, right? So this gets into the area of people aren't amendable, people aren't fixable, right down to the base code of who you are. So what's being happened is that those who are complete, i.e. the jars back to the gospel of truth that are made perfect and pure, are being corrupted, held prisoner, violated, in many cases raped, sodomized, destroyed, obliterated, re-embodied, reincarnated, brought back over and over again, and used as a source code for a solar or sun center, the energy that the pure and perfect beings that are identified in the number 144,000 really is 144 in the phi or the phi sequence and where it takes place. And the phi or phi Fibonacci golden mean is the key, is the field key to rectifying, integer, reducing, clarifying, and returning back into the original order. So what we have here is we have a display to the Khazarians, or the evil Jews, right, if you will, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, if you want to get into all this shit, right? But what you have is this Talmudic, Kabbalistic display of a breakoff from the original 6 spheres that we talk about in EPL, this perfect representation, right, of energy production. We see it over and over again, and that you could easily use this as a codified system to figure out which alchemical constants could take place. I mean, you're talking about the key to everything, and 0-point energy, and really where the strong, weak nuclear force and other forces that interact might take place there, right? So, but the whole point being is that you have this breakoff with this seed or this flower or this tree of life through Talmudic Kabbalistic traditions that infer four additional components down below to those 6 spherical, perfect, and pure representations. That they would see things instantly, these errors, these false ones, as a way, a mechanism to bastardize and pollute and pervert the original source. So, in essence, that is our harkening back, our resonance with God and a God source, right? A pure source. And that a deviation from this would be compromising everything, remaking everything and everyone to a point of redundancy and ephemeral, finite acquisitional order, where there had to be a Nietzschean flat time paradox, if you will, or reset that's based on pi standards, or the spherical plate tradition that really harkens back to the circumpunct, right? Where you see the circumpunct depicted as stellar mass. You see the circumpunct on the side of Masonic halls with the two lines on the side correlating a specific time, a moment in time, a moment of capture, right? A right and left paradigm, a way in, a way out, an up and a down. It infers directionality. It infers the compass and the square and the manipulation, right? So we're going to end it here before we go too much longer here. That way I can speed this up a little bit and make it something that people can actually watch, because this is very important information.